Ervin Stutzman, December 9, 2019.
This morning, it's a real privilege to have Ervin Stutzman with us. Unfortunately, in May, when he was scheduled to come, he, I believe, was ill, so he looks pretty good today. We know Ervin in lots of different roles. Most of us know him from his leadership in the Mennonite Church. If you were in Lancaster County a while back, you might have had him as your bishop. I know Ervin primarily through his daughter, who was a student of mine, so I know he's a wonderful father and probably grandfather. I can't speak to that. So we're happy to have him here today to talk about his life as a writer. So welcome, Ervin.
Well, thank you, Terry, for that introduction and for your patience when I couldn't be here in May, and your last minute stepping in and having someone else take over there. Last Sunday, that's just yesterday, I showed this slide at Zion Mennonite Church where I was speaking. This is Advent. We were considering Isaiah 11. And I pointed out that the painter of this picture was Ed Hicks, a well-known Quaker back in the late 1700s and up to mid-1800s, who painted perhaps 100 different versions of this kind of scene. An itinerant preacher who traveled around the church speaking about the peaceable kingdom and God's desire for peace. And of course, it's not lost on me that on this particular painting, it has a scene from probably the late 17th century with Quakers trading with Native Americans. So he saw this vision of Isaiah with these animals, this unlikely gathering of animals and children and vipers. He saw that as a precursor to the peacemaking that would come through Jesus Christ as he showed up in the Quakers. And if I were a painter, perhaps I would put Jacob Hofstetter in that scene in some way or other. Now, just about Advent, 8 years ago, in November of 2011, I happened to have an opportunity to meet with John Ruth. I've known him in different contexts, but it happened that a meeting got canceled that day, and so I slipped over to Souderton to have lunch with him. And we talked about the possibility of writing a book about Jacob Hofstetter and his interaction with Native Americans. Now, I knew that John cared deeply about that subject because he wrote the Lancaster Mennonite Conference history and has quite a long section devoted to Native Americans in Lancaster and sort of a growing awareness of the interaction between Mennonites and Native Americans. And so I was just posing the question, might this be a good idea? Well, John thought it was a great idea. He said, now there's some real understanding these days of ways that Native Americans have been wrong. And don't get on the wrong side of history here to tell the story about Jacob Hofstetter. But he said it's time to write that story. It needs to be done now. So do it. Well, that was an encouragement to me, John Ruth. He did express some amusement, I must say, that a leader in the Mennonite Church, I was the executive director for Mennonite Church USA at the time, his amusement that a leader would be writing fiction. I guess he was remembering the days when Mennonites were discouraged from reading novels, much less writing them. He must have forgotten about Meyer Dogsberger, who wrote historical novels. He was the leader in the Mennonite Church. So I'm addressing the question here, first of all. What motivated me to write a series of historical novels about my Amish ancestors and their interaction with Native Americans? especially in light of my very busy schedule with Mennonite Church USA. So looking back now from the standpoint of retirement, it seems a bit lucrative to take on this undertaking. Naive, I'm searching for words, preposterous, that I would try to take on this task, or maybe even to try to explain my own motivation for writing. So I'm aware there's different layers of motivation, and I may not even be aware of some of those layers as I'm speaking to you this morning. Some of you might have a better idea than I do, or perhaps it's hidden to both of us. But here we go. The bottom line is, I would say, that I'm curious about people. So, one of the things that I enjoyed most about my role with Mennonite Church USA was the opportunity to touch base with a wide diversity of people, both inside our church and out. Now, I could fill the rest of the time just telling you about that, but I'll just show you a couple of slides that stood out to me as being unlikely. One is when I was asked to assist with the baptism of 7 Bhutanese Nepalese congregants in Pittsburgh. They have quite a story of immigration and being here, and Donna Mast, who was the conference minister in the Allegheny Conference, invited me to speak there, and these folks wanted me to be involved. The story of what happened there is its own kind of story. Being with Goshen College students one night from about, 9:30 to 12:30 or whatever, 21 of them packed into a room, talking about things that are really important to college students, and to me actually, as Mennonite Church USA. Some of you might recognize these people. I remember a dinner with Church of God participants at their annual conference in Orlando, Florida. We were official dialogue partners, the Mennonite Church USA and Church of God, Cleveland, Tennessee, because they felt they could learn something about their pacifist background and history from the Mennonites. We thought we could benefit from learning about their emphasis on the Holy Spirit. That brought us together in interesting ways. Some of you might be noticing, I suppose especially one person in this room will be noticing this gentleman right here, Andre Gingrich Stoner, his brother's name. And then traveling on the Hopi Reservation, again, I suppose, Don, you're Don Stud, you might recognize this person, a Hopi Indian guide showing us the petroglyphs there in the, on that reservation. And I'll just end with one more here because this was very significant. I started my role with Mennonite Church USA in January of 2010. And one of the first things that I did in those months was visit centenarians in the Mennonite Church. She's one of them. Well, I discovered this is a very interesting person. She was only 101 at that time. But she was busy. She showed me her closet. She could open up her closet, all her study desk and her work. She was working on genealogical projects, etc. She is actually one of the co-publishers of a very thick book on the immigrant connections for prominent Mennonite names. So it's a thick book. She's a genealogical researcher, but much more. And for this talk this morning, the significant thing is she was commissioned back in 1960s by the General Conference Mennonite Church to write a drama of Jacob Hostetler's encounter with the Indians. So she wrote a very nice act of play, which they used during that time as a promotion for peacemaking in the General Conference Church. So she and her husband had a mixed marriage, so to speak. They came from both traditions, I guess. Anyhow, she lived in 2016, and I stayed in touch with her. And you'll see here, she actually she's holding my book, Jacob's Choice. She was 104 at that time. And I remember asking if I could assist her in walking to her room. No, she could do it by herself. She had her own walker and was making good progress, thank you. But she actually talked at this, she gave her own story at this lecture I had at the book signing, and she was there, and I dedicated this book to her. She died in 2016, so you'll see her age there, 106 years old at the time. Well, those are just some examples of my connecting with a diversity of people. It gives me, well, I just get a lot of joy out of it. I think it might be part of the Stutzman, maybe the nice, I'm not quite sure. But I just have deep joy when I have the opportunity to make significant connection with people who are significantly different than me. And that's an important part to say, because here's the essence of it. Building understanding between diverse peoples is a way to express the values of the peaceable king. And I lament our highly polarized society, and I hope to find ways to mitigate those divisions that we have. And I must say, I'm more aware now than I was at the time I wrote these, how I might contribute to that problem, especially in the era of Trump. But I digress. I had the sense then, as I started out on this project, as I do now, to some chastening extent, that if people truly understood each other, they would stay together and work together for the best of the whole, good of the whole. I know there's a mountain of evidence to the contrary, but I cling to this belief. I wouldn't be an interim pastor at Zion Mennonite Church if I didn't believe that. Now, how does this relate to the writing of novels? Just this. You know, as a college student, I wasn't aspiring to be a writer or a reader of fine literature. I took the obligatory courses in composition and literature. But it was later on, in graduate school, that I took courses that really got me interested. How was that? Well, courses at Temple University in composition, not in composition, but in ethnography, in rhetoric, historiography, anthropology. These were things which really piqued my curiosity about the deep differences between people and how to understand them and how to write about them. So the concept, for example, of plausibility structures, sociology of knowledge, maybe that doesn't make sense to you, but those things really got a hold of me to understand. I came to see that my view of the world was deeply shaped by where I was born and the place I grew up and the people that I grew up with, my Amish heritage. So these studies, along with studies in spiritual formation, say like at the seminary, prompted my curiosity, which leads me to ask a different set of questions when I'm with people, or at least when I write about people, to think about a whole different set of questions. Like this. Like what makes people unique? How do they live out their faith? What do they cling to in tough times? Or how do they express their creativity? How do they adapt when things go wrong? Well, what gives them hope? So those kind of questions are the ones that I love to talk to people. But you don't start that. It's like the layers of an onion, where the outside is artifacts, where we talk about things like what people wear. Nice sweater. Or what did you have for breakfast? Or what kind of a car do you drive? You know, all those kind of questions. They're just on the surface. But as you get deeper and peel off layers of this onion, you might gradually get to the very heart of worldview, how people make sense of the world. And I just say my curiosity always presses me down toward the core as much as possible. But that takes trusting communication. It doesn't just come in a first conversation with people, most times at least. So, perhaps because I grew up in the Amish tradition, I'm particularly sensitive to the way that my education, my progressive view of the world, my cultured speech, may stand in the way of trusting communication with people I'd like to get to know, people I'd like to work with. So, especially people with less education, people who perhaps haven't finished high school. And I must say, that includes my 5 siblings, 3 of whom are still living, who do not have a high school education. So I'm sort of the outlier in my family, and I'm very conscious of my interest in communicating with them at a trusting level in ways that is different than the seminary classroom or this meeting this morning. I remember one occasion at a seminary faculty retreat when I was dean. Almost everybody sitting at the table had a doctorate, maybe all but one. And I remember very specifically at that meeting thinking, my mother would not be able to make any sense out of this conversation this morning. The level of abstraction and assumptions were just a whole different world than she lived in. She wasn't living at the time, I had that thought, but I thought of it of others, like my siblings. So, particularly when an encounter with someone who's less educated than me moves through multiple layers, I just rejoice. I'm just grateful when it happens. Let me just share an example from last Friday. As I mentioned, I'm now a co-pastor with my wife at Zion Interim. And someone had put a note on the front door, you should visit so-and-so who's a needy person in this community. They didn't even give a phone number, just an address. So we decided to do it. So last Friday, we struck out and came to visit this couple. We had been told in this little paper, and then through a secret conversation with the person who posted the paper, that this couple had both experienced a stroke. They're elderly people, they don't get any visits, they don't get out. Once you visit people. So we stopped in. Now, we walk in the door, and how do you connect with people like this? The Broadway folks out on West Broadway. Well, God met us. That was amazing. And here's a conversation. This starts with artifacts. And in this little conversation with this man who's probably in his 70s, Bonnie kind of had a little parallel conversation going on with a woman part of the time. I discovered we had something very interesting and very unusual in common. He was a jack of all trades, and in his life, one time, he had made a 40 Chevrolet street rod. I said, what? Me too! I made a 40 Chevrolet street rod coupe. Yeah, right. That got us into a conversation. Well, let me take it one level further. I said, well, I just sort of unusual with mine. I cut off the front frame of the firewall and put a Nova front end on it. He said, I did that too! And I'm thinking, that wouldn't happen to 1 in 50 million people in the United States. That is so very, very unusual. So we had this connection going between us in ways that I could not have dreamed of when I knocked on the front door. If it had only gone there, I probably wouldn't be telling the story. But before I left, he told me about being a Marine. Having gone to the Marine Corps when he was a very young man, went to Vietnam, fought in the jungles, and I just listened. He told me how people asked him, did you kill anyone? He said, I hope not. He said, that was a bad war. And he talked about how it was to come back to the United States and see protesters on the streets. He just felt so bad, like, what am I supposed to do? And at that moment, as I was listening, I just was tearing up. It's like, this is very, very meaningful to him. We moved way past the onion from those artifacts of my old 40 Chevrolet, way down to some meaning. I began to see possibilities, in fact. I sensed the nudging of the Spirit that one of these days, I'm going to go back there by the grace of God. We're going to have a conversation with God about what it means for him to be a veteran who's unhappy with what happened. How could that have happened? By the grace of God. But you see my fulfillment in having it happen. And that's very closely related to why I write novels. Here's the point that I'm getting at. that writing lives, that is, writing about people, whether in the form of family stories or in writing novels, is a way for me to make a connection about important life questions with a diverse group of people, including those who are less educated than me. And so when I write, and particularly when I preach, I often think of something that Martin Luther, Protestant reformer, once said. He said, when I preach, I don't pay much attention to the doctors and the magistrates in my congregation, of whom there are more than 40 in my congregation. My eyes are all on the maids and the children. And if the others don't like it, they can leave. Okay, well, as he said that, and I feel that same way sometimes. So, the importance of this was borne out in conversation with my Uncle Ervin. I'm named after him. I was writing my book, Tobias of the Amish, and I gave him a draft, just as I gave it to all my father's siblings and in-laws for feedback. And when I sat with him, I was amazed at the number of words he didn't know, the vocabulary. Now this is my uncle who founded Stutzman's greenhouse. He's actually quite wealthy at the time and very successful. But he's not an avid reader. And, well, I just realized there's a lot more people in the world like him than there are like me when it comes to that. And I want to communicate with him and others, especially the Amish, who are connected with my father. So that's a passion in me. Whatever I write, with one notable exception, the scholarly book I published recently, I want people to read it who even are less educated than me or may see the world differently than me. So it ended up that a lot of people all across the spectrum read the lives of the Amish, and am a widow among the Amish, and some of you are those readers. And how do I know that a variety of people read them? Because of the dozens and dozens of journal pages that I wrote in conversations with people and the letters and notes they sent me. But most of all, I want to mention Dr. Dan Miller. Dan Miller is a physician in Ohio who I knew as a donor at EMU. That was my first connection with him. But he heard me tell a story about the background of writing these, about learning about my family, the embarrassment that it was for me, and how difficult it was for me to tell some of those family secrets, and how liberating it was. Well, Dan said, you have to go on the road. Now, why did he say that? He said, it makes you human. People see you very differently when they read those books than if they hear you being the dean at Eastern Mennonite Seminary. It just changes who they think of you. Right, I get that. I understand. Well, I didn't then as much, but I do now. So this experience, along with my desire to explore my faith heritage, as expressed in the 18th century, led me into this writing of novel. So these are fiction. These are lightly fictionized accounts of my parents. Dr. Paul Neisler from Messiah College said, they're not fiction. He read it and he said, that's really a history of your family. Here was the standard from those was, it could have happened exactly like that. We're not exactly sure, but it sure could have, and that's what everybody attested that read those who knew my family well. Now, I see this way as connected with the distant audience. And particularly in the Midwest, there are Amish who trace their lineage back to Hochstetler. Hundreds of them, thousands of them. Now, I trace my lineage back to him 8 ways. I mean, my parents, my grandparents, and 6 of my great-grandparents are direct descendants. How's that for multiplying the connections in the genes? Now, it gets worse than that. I know of one Amish woman who is connected 49 different ways to the same ancestor. And I'm guessing there are many of you here today who know you're connected. Raise your hand if you know you're connected to Huxley. Okay? Well, let's at least triple that number for those of you who don't know. Because it's amazing how people find out. Now, about the time I was starting this novel, Dan Hosteller of Indiana reminded us all that at the moment when one of the times when I was dean at Eastern Mennonite Seminary, the president of Heston College, Howard Kine, the president of Eastern Mennonite College, or Eastern University, Lawrence Schwarzenegger, the president of Bluffton College, Lee Steyer, the president of Goshen College, James Brenneman, the dean of AMBS, Lauren Johns, and the dean of Eastern Mennonite Seminary, Ervin Stutzman, are all direct descendants of Jacob Hosteller. Get the picture? That is not to mention their faculties and staff, because there were at least 2 people in the cabinet besides me who are direct descendants of Jacob Hosteller at Eastern Mennonite University. So my point is, when I write about this man, a lot of people with a stake in what I say and how I say it. That makes the work particularly challenging. But I got a lot of key people along the way who encouraged me. Like Harold Press said, yes, they're eager to have it. I sat with Merle and Phyllis Good in the summer of 2011 in Lancaster. Yes, it's time to write a book about interaction with Native Americans. But here's another one of those, probably that stood out the most to me. I happened to be in Boulder, Colorado, and I met Bill Unruh. Bill had been a professor at Bethel College, but he finished out his career at Wichita State University. Now, how did we get together? Because his wife played four-hand piano with my son Daniel. I mean, how do you predict these things? But here we sat, and he said, I read your book, Tobias of the Amish. He said, I went with my dad one time. We bought a truck bed from your father. Okay, here's another one of these connections you don't expect. But he encouraged me to write a historical novel. Now, why did that make a big difference to me? Because he's a distinguished historian. He is the emeritus distinguished professor of history at Wichita State. He's published 11 different works, nationally known as the expert on Native Americans. And like federal interaction, laws connecting, and other things. And he said, you need to write a novel. I go, what's this coming from a historian? He says, I give classes, my history classes, historical novels to read. Because it gets them into the topic. He gave the example of Across the Wide Missouri, which he said helps people understand the trade that took place across the Rockies. And once they get really into the history, they're motivated to read the history itself. It's a Pulitzer Prize reading book, by the way. So I was just really tickled to hear that kind of encouragement. So novels are a way, I say, for us to walk in someone else's moccasins. Pun intended. So there we are. It's a way like memoirs, to have people walking in somebody else's shoes, to share their life for a few hours in a deep way. And, research has shown that people who read novels often are more empathetic to people who are different than they are. Because you walk in their shoes. And that's what I decided I wanted to do. So, how was well, one more thing about Unwrap. He told me it's time to tell the truth about the interaction of the Amish Mennonites with Native Americans. So how was I to tell that truth? How was I to know that truth? How was I to discover that truth? Just this week, I learned that the word true in the English language comes from, its etymology is the word tree. Because the Anglo-Saxons thought of truth as just being something deeply rooted in the ground. And so I see truth as being an accurate account of on a variety of levels, including different realities faced by diverse people. And I determined that my historical novels would be consistent with all of the historical facts that are known about Hosteller and consistent with the history and culture of that time. Maybe you could call it verisimilitude in the pursuit of deep truth. Now, I owe a lot to Beth Hosteller Mark of Messiah College Library, who wrote, and I have it on the table over here along with a few other resources, a documentary history of this story. So she did an extensive documentation of primary sources that were available for that time to tell that story. And I owe a lot to her for that. So I set out to discover the history and culture and the person of Jacob Hostetler. So what did I have to study? Oh wow, Native American studies, particularly about the Delawares and the Shawnee, Hostetler history and genealogy, the French and Indian War, which is when this happened, Amish and Mennonites in Pennsylvania during colonial time, lots of primary sources like one I just mentioned here, artifacts of the time. I'll just take you through a few of these. This is a sign in Pennsylvania, put up by Pennsylvania Road sign, about the incident that happened, the Indian attack with Jacob Hostetler. Actually, I'm arguing the date they have on there, but they say this is the first organized Amish Mennonite congregation in Pennsylvania. And they named Hostetler here and his 3 members of his family. For those of you who are not familiar with the story, because of his peace convictions, he refused to shoot at Indians who were around the house in the early hours of the morning, and it ended up, the story is much more dramatic than this, but it ended up that his wife and 2 children were killed, and he and his son were taken captive. So I went to enactments of the French and Indian War, several occasions. This just shows you them reenacting what happened during those times. And what's especially interesting is that this enactment took place at the place where my ancestor Joseph Hostetler, one of those in captive, was held for a time. Right here, and I can almost guarantee that he dipped his foot in the water. I was thinking most of his but this is at the intersection of Deer Creek and French Creek. So this just shows where that happened. And this is the place in Ohio where Colonel Bouquet, as a colonel of the English folks, gave a decree that all the captives had to be released, all the British subjects. And so it happened here. I'd like to just take exception to the way the sign is written. It says here, Bouquet subdued the Delawares, Senecas, and Shawnees without firing a shot. In other words, wasn't a battle there. Secured the freedom of every colonial captive and obtained promises of peace, a feat unequaled in colonial American history. That's true, but it's not said that his threats, that if they did not do that, he'd wipe out the villages. So there you have it. I read things like a new genre in American history at that time, which is called, which are narratives about captivity. There are many captivity narratives. This is one of the prominent ones. It's the 15 first-hand accounts of people who were taken captive and then escaped or whatever. So I picture this book because James Smith, one of the people who gave an account inside this book, is quoted at some length in the historical background to the Jacob Hostetler genealogy, which is on the table over there. And so I relied on these. However, this genre of writing, captivity narratives, was used to perpetuate myths about the Indians and to get people to fight against them. Important to understand that. I studied maps. This is one provided by Beth Hostetler Mark, who traced the route which Hostetler was taken by as a captive from here in the North Kill, in Berks County, all the way up to Fort Presque Isle, very outside of Pennsylvania, and then back. Into that in depth, but just to say there's a lot of work being done on that. And I followed that route too, by the way, with my car. I'm using Indian paths in Pennsylvania, books that are written as much as possible to follow those routes. Now, the things that I learned in this pursuit of study reshaped my original plans. I moved from 1 novel to 3 to make sure I could tell the story in a little different way here. And to make these start, I should mention this one now. This is a map that shows the Indian land cessions. So, you'll see that where William Penn first bought, so to speak, land from the natives, which would be like Germantown, Pennsylvania, you'll see how settlers got more and more land across Pennsylvania through these years. This is probably the most egregious one. You probably heard of the walking purchase of 1737, in which the natives promised that they would give the land to what a man could cover in one day. So this man was to walk somewhere along here. Well, the colony hired 3 runners to train for this event, and they ran. So they probably claimed at least 3 times as much territory as had been planned. 2 of them, I guess, were repaid somehow, and then they both died afterwards from exhaustion. But one lived. Anyhow, they ended up getting this land in the walking purchase, and that's a real important understanding of background for the deep resentment of the Delaware people for whites against whites during those years. Let's keep going. What did I discover? Well, I'll just name some of the hard truths, seeking truth, some of the hard truths I discovered along the way. Many Amish and Mennonites came to Pennsylvania in response to William Penn's invitation to pacifist peoples, non-resistant peoples. And they didn't realize, I don't think, that they were moving onto land that had recently been negotiated with the 6 tribes, the 6 nations, who essentially sold it away from under the Delawares, who were considered a lesser people. Here again, you have a deep resentment about people who were being pushed away from land they'd had for generations. And and to some extent by fellow natives in coordination with whites who gave them the deal in other ways. Now, William Penn, as a Quaker, had very high aspirations, noble aspirations for the ownership of this land. He really tried to do what was right by this. But what he projected for land ownership and people ending up with deeds for their property ran totally in contrast to the way Native Americans understood ownership of land. They never perceived that settlers would block them from fishing in the creeks and hunting on the properties they'd had for generations. The concept of ownership is so dramatically different. And the Native Americans were caught in the competition for land between the English and the French, particularly. And this came out finally, and most dramatically, in the French and Indian War, which of course is named by the English. For the natives, it was the English and French war that they were engaged in, and they became pawns in that war. And the gifts, there was a high competition for gifts. Who could give the best gifts? Was it the English or the French? Of course, when the war was over, the gift giving stopped. Now, although the European settlers were convinced that their culture was vastly superior to the native folk, there are few, if any, documented cases of natives leaving their way of life to become like the American settlers. But there are thousands of cases of Europeans leaving the European way to become Native American people. That's just an understanding that's completely lost to most of us. Along that point, white folks have long believed that natives were unique in the practice of scalping people to terrorize their enemies. However, it's just as likely that they learned the practice of scalping from Europeans themselves who used this practice. Furthermore, both the French and the English incentivized scalping by paying for the scalps of their enemies. The English paid, this is in the records, our historical, legal records. The English paid the natives for scalping French and vice versa. Now, I found very fascinating, in their compensation for scalps, the English generally paid twice as much for the scalp of an adult man as they did for women or children. In contrast, the natives demanded twice the price for a childbearing woman than they did for a native warrior. That's a topic for another area, another time. But again, in most cases, Native Americans did not terrorize villages or take captives in random fashion, as you might get the impression from reading captivity narratives. Rather, most times, Native Americans knew the individuals who lived there and attacked them with very specific objectives, either in revenge for specific wrongs that had been done, or to seek replacements for specific members that had been killed in their own community. And these replacements would function in much the same way as the original person. So even sometimes men would play the role of women in their work because they had lost someone like that. I can't go into depth here. Now, it's common to speak of Indian massacres where Native Americans have killed multiple whites. And indeed, through the literature for centuries, we have known about the Hochstetler massacre. I think I actually used that terminology when I first started. I don't use that anymore. I call it the Hochstetler attack. The truth is that white settlers and American warriors were just as likely to commit massacres as any natives. And the most egregious of these happened in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, when the Paxton Boys massacred the Conestogas. I suppose many of you know this, but the Conestogas were peace-loving native peoples who were put into jail in Lancaster to protect them against the threats they had had. And these Paxton Boys, on a Sunday, broke down the jail, tore down the doors, yanked these people out of captivity, and murdered them in cold blood. And that is a red stain that is indelible in the history of that place. But I'll come back to that just a bit later on. Now, the concept of whiteness grew up during the French and Indian War particularly. It grew up as the desire of white folks to distinguish between their own privileges and rights and those of Negro slaves or Native Americans. And so the concept of red and black and white really gained prominence during that time. Partly because whites promoted the ideas that blacks, Negroes, and red folks had a different kind of soul than white folks. They weren't completely human. That typology persists to this day. Now, while individual Europeans, including Anabaptists, treated Native Americans according to their own beliefs, not everybody treated them the same way. The overall approach of European settlers can be described by the broad rubric of the doctrine of discovery. That is, it granted Christian explorers and discoverers, like Columbus and others, the right to colonize and convert and enslave native peoples around the world and claim their land in the name of Christ. This approach gave legal cover for white Christian conquerors to displace natives wherever they went. And laws like that are still on the books today in the United States of America. Now, there are a few Christian groups who took a very different approach to natives, and most significantly, the Movavi, who evangelized among the Delawares particularly, and even formed Native American congregations. Probably the most well-known of those missionaries was John Ervin. And I put a copy of one of his books over here because it's considered the most helpful ethnography of natives in colonial times. I've heard that most scholars today who write about Native Americans depend on that book for primary information about the customs of Native people. And he considered natives to be fully human. Now, the whites initiated many treaties with Native Americans, but they felt little compunction to actually keep these treaties. Some scholars say that whites actually broke every treaty they made with natives, and that natives kept all of them. I can't defend that, but it's said. Because the whites were more powerful, the natives had little remedy for broken treaties. So perhaps today, the most difficult dilemma that most of us in this room face is the realization that our Mennonite and Amish forebears benefited from the wars and the other acts of forced acquisition which claimed native land that was made available to us by the government. That's not just true in Berks County, Pennsylvania. That's true in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and just right on west, wherever Mennonites have gone. So these are very difficult truths. How can we right this wrong? How can we tell the stories of our Anabaptist heroes' faithfulness while acknowledging their failures and our failures and smallness of perspective along this line? So for me at least, the answer lies in telling the truth in a variety of ways. I sought to tell the truth via stories, a series of novels. Others choose perhaps to do it through social action or through some other educational means, for example, about the document discovery. But the feedback from my readers of the novels has supported my approach in this way. It appears that many readers are willing to live with the tensions which arise when they identify deeply with the characters who are in these novels, who have a very different point of view. And this response underscores my belief that if we walk a mile in someone else's moccasins, we'll have a better understanding of what they do. So let me just explain these three novels which I wrote. So this is Jacob's Choice. And there are two primary point of view characters. The first is Jacob Hochstetler himself and his daughter, Barbara Stutzman. And on the table over here you can see the genealogies of the two of those. But they had a very different perspective, but primarily it's settler's perspective. This is the typical perspective that Amish have promoted for many years. Now, the second book I wrote is called Joseph's Dilemma. This is Jacob's son, and the two characters here are Jacob Hochstetler himself, and then Touching Sky, the Native American woman who adopted him into a native family. Here you begin to see a very different picture with the clash between native and whites, and how Joseph became a white Indian. And again, I owe it to Beth Hochstetler Mark, who wrote a significant master thesis on white Indians. That term, of course, means someone who has left European settlement and joined a Native American community to the extent that they began to think like an Indian, a white Indian. Now the third takes yet a different tack. This is Christian Hochstetler, and I'm not actually, he's another son of Jacob, but I'm not actually a direct descendant of his. Jacob had 4 sons, or 4 children, and I'm descended from only 3 of them, so I'm not Christian. There are people, yes, there are people who are descended from all 4 of them. But here he is. He is the main character, and then in this case, the other main character is Anna Hochstetler, who is his stepmother, the second wife of Jacob Hochstetler. And this brings a very different perspective into it, lots of layers of interest. I should mention that the primary antagonist in this novel is Jacob Hochstetler himself, the father of Christian, because it was so difficult for him to understand that Christian could be a white Indian. This son of his could come back and think like an Indian. And you might say, how did you dream that up? You know, the story of Christian and Joseph have been in the family genealogy for 100 years, hidden in plain sight. All you have to do is just read it and you see that's right there. So that's where I got that idea. Now, I'm gratified to hear about some of the folks who have been reading Jacob's Choice and others. The one that thrilled me the most was to hear about a congregation in Virginia where some of the men come to church with a shotgun rack in their pickups. And they're reading Jacob's Choice. These are people who some might call rednecks, but they're reading these novels. They wouldn't stand a sermon on peacemaking. But they love these stories. Wow, you talk about stealth. It's awesome. So, let me close this last section by speaking about hope. Because just telling the truth about these things will not do. Particularly when it's overwhelming truth, like climate change. You have to have ways that people can hold on to hope. And that's why I especially call this Christian's hope. In the last few pages of that novel, I showed what that hope might look like from a Christian point of view. As a minister of the gospel, I think particularly of hope as tied to the experience of God's grace to the wrongs and troubles of the world. Now, one can think of trouble in both a horizontal and a vertical dimension. So, trouble can arise from interaction with other human beings, like in the French and Indian War, or interaction with God. The burden God puts on us to do this or that. God's commandments, for example, can sometimes be thought of as trouble. But I think of hope this way. In short, trouble plus grace equals hope, when grace is bigger than trouble. I picked up this definition from Paul Scott Wilson, who's a prominent teacher of preachers in Toronto, Ontario. So as educated Mennonites, I, have been cultured to think of peace and justice as a way to deal with the troubles of the world, particularly where there's conflict and people have wronged each other. But I'm here to say that our efforts toward peace and justice will fall short if we don't emphasize God's enabling grace. It's by God's grace that we're able to see we have wronged someone in the first place, that we have wronged someone, and seek forgiveness and justice and reconciliation. It's by God's grace that we can make trusting connections with people, to be able to talk about these wrong differences. Like what happened last Friday morning. I say God's grace was there that made it possible for us to talk about the Vietnam War. It's an unlikely situation. It's by God's grace that we can truly love our enemies or find reconciliation with them. Yeah, here's a second slide I showed yesterday in Advent. This is another one by Ed Hicks. But in this one, he actually writes. And what does he say? When man, I'm sure he's thinking of humanity in general there, when man is led and moved by sovereign grace, his grim, carnivorous nature then shall cease. Let's talk about these animals and their tendency to eat each other. And not one savage beast be seen to frown, he says, a little child shall lead them on in love. I agree with Ed Hicks. It's by God's sovereign grace that can happen. It's only by God's sovereign grace that can happen. So I believe that grace, peace, and justice are a powerful antidote to the wrongs and troubles of the world. When these come together, hope rises. I saw hope rise in the way that the Mennonites in Lancaster built a longhouse and worked together with Native American reenactors to tell the story of these people. And hope rose for me when we had this reenactment there several years ago, a couple years ago, when people read from my 3 novels and reenacted them in these situations. And one of those was Rusty Sherrick here, whom I worked with closely in the writing of these novels. And actually, this is Bruce Pye with her back to us here. But in this particular session, he was reading a section from Jacob's choice, and he broke down and started to weep. And he said, I just want to ask forgiveness for what my people have done to your people. He's speaking of the Delaware. Well, I didn't realize I was taking this picture, but I had been sitting over on the side, and I just walked over to him and put my arm around him and said, we're the people who need to ask forgiveness for what our folks have done to your folks. My hope rose when we had a conversation that day. It was a little bit like a back and forth dialogue between Jessica McPherson of the Susquehanna, and me in this case, moderated by Becky Dockenauer, who was at that time the director of the Hans Herr House and the Indian Longhouse. We had a dialogue on telling history with integrity of the Amish and the natives. She, by the way, this Jessica McPherson, was the first person to speak at the Mennonite World Conference in 2015 in Pennsylvania, when natives were recognized for their part of the land and people marched up. She didn't go in costume, but she doesn't like that. But she was the person who spoke up in that case. So my hope was people like her, some folks were there, and later invited us. We went to a library in Reading, and there's another event coming up there shortly. But my hope rise was when we could talk together in that kind of way. I saw hope rise in 2011 when the Presbyterians and the Mennonites got together and officially asked forgiveness for natives in the Lancaster area where the evils of what had happened in the Conestoga Massacre and others like that. I see hope rise in Mennonite Church USA, or MCC I should say, promoting the series on the doctrine of discovery. I see hope rise in the way that Mennonite Church USA and Mennonite Church Canada opens their conventions by speaking about native land that once has been occupied by Mennonites and others. And I feel hope in the way that Peter McGay, who's a native member of, a Navajo member of the Mennonite Church USA Executive Board, or was a number of years ago I was there, for her finding her voice and being able to read Navajo and pray in Navajo in the meeting, and for the two of us to share a seminar on Jacob Hofstetter, where she can tell about her perspective from Navajo perspective, and I can speak about mine. That's the hope rises. And finally, hope rises. What hope rose, and I saw the face of God in a television show of all places, where I was asked to appear with Katie Segal. Katie Segal is an American actress and a singer-songwriter with her own little spot on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. I'm not a TV watcher, not many movies, so I have not even heard of her. But I was contacted because of my work with Jacob Hofstetter to meet on the show, which is called Who Do You Think You Are?, which is set up to work with celebrities to tell them about distant ancestors. And her ancestor is Jacob Hofstetter. She'd never even heard of Mennonites. She had only the most rudimentary knowledge of Amish, like people who drive buggies. And because this is like a reality show where the truth is kept from her and revealed just gradually along the way, I met her at the time when she learned what actually happened to Jacob Hofstetter. I had the privilege of telling her that story on TV. And I'm telling you, it was filled with grace, because off camera, I had several hours to talk with her about what I really believe about peacemaking. It was awesome. I'll confess, I missed church that Sunday morning. It was filmed during the Sunday morning. Okay, I had a church service in the evening. But I told Bonnie, I said, this was worth any church service I could have been in, because here I was speaking face to face with somebody whose parents were known as peaceniks. And here she discovers that centuries before, she had an ancestor whose family gave their lives for their beliefs about peace. It moved her deeply. No expression from the show. But she wept at the end of that show, to think about what this meant, this new knowledge, what it meant for her family. She said, I don't know that I could have done it. Even though I believe in peace, I'm not sure that I could have done it. And organizers of the show told me later that no other celebrity that they've done this show with had ever been emotionally moved like she was by that program. And I say, thanks be to God in the most unlikely ways. So thanks for listening to this story.
Questions or comments for Ervin? I'll bring the mic. Be sure to state your name, and let's go on with your next question or comment. Where do we go? Right here.
Ervin, what is your position on reparations for Mennonites?
Well, I'd say I don't have a position. Positions get us into trouble lots of times. I'd say I have an interest. I have an interest in seeing how can we find ways to compensate natives for what our people have done. And that's a very difficult question. How do you do that? But I think there must be ways, and I'm moved by examples. I think on the front page of Mennonite World Review not long ago was a photograph, a story of a woman in Kansas who had given part of her family inheritance to natives. For me, I've given proceeds of my book to like the native, to the Longhouse, for example. Those are very small and inadequate ways, but they're interest that show ways. And I want to remain open to seeing what might be creative and just ways of doing that.
Okay, next question. Here, Harvey.
Wednesday evening, there'll be a hearing at Spotswood High School on the Second Amendment. And Tazewell County has already approved, supported the idea of having a militia formed in their county. How do we somehow tell this alternative story to people who, I've been in conversation with ex-Mennonites and some current Mennonites who are all into this militia thing and in support of this protest against possible restrictions on gun rights?
Well, that's a hard question, but let me give this perspective. A couple of weeks ago, in preparation for a sermon at Zion Mennonite, on a passage in Romans, I ran across this term called "put on the armor of light." Here I discovered that that's the name of a documentary film in which an evangelical, prominent conservative evangelical minister takes a new position on what it means to have gun control in coordination with a black woman from the South whose son was shot by a white man standing his ground in Florida. Now this is an amazing film because it puts two people together that we just never see together in our polarized world. An evangelical man who's going around the country encouraging people to put on the armor of light as opposed to depending on the Second Amendment. And he is talking to people I could never get audience with. So I'd say partner with people like that. In other words, find ways where there's that's by the grace of God, by the way. Find amazing ways that by the grace of God, people make a connection and nurture that connection. Because I'm quite convinced I can stand up and talk till I'm blue in the face about the Second Amendment, and they'll say, and what kind of gun do you own? And I'll say, I don't have a gun. I might tell them the story of being about 6 years old when my brother had an overnight guest, and I got displaced from my bunk bed and had to sleep with my mother that night, my widowed mother. But I snuck out of the room to listen to my brother's conversation. And you must understand, my brother had a shotgun and a rifle and a pistol, all three hanging above his bunk bed where this guest was sleeping. And here's what I heard. My brother asked this man, who was a parolee from prison, he said, "Why did you get put in prison?" He said, "My brother and I got into an argument, and he threw a shoe at me, and I said, if you throw another shoe at me, I'll shoot you." And he did, and I did. This young man sleeping in my bed was telling my brother he had shot and killed his own brother for throwing a shoe at him. And you know what I'm thinking? There are 3 guns above my brother's bed. I hope they don't get into an argument.
All right, next question, comment? Did we cover it all? Over here, Mark.
I'm really appreciative so much of what you've done and have helped us to understand this morning. I'm really very appreciative. And what I've been reflecting on is the opportunities that we've had in this community to find ways to relate to international students, mostly in ways that build, you find the layers as you learn to know them. And it doesn't have to be something that's just so big. It can be individual people building relationships of love and care that last and reach far beyond what we can imagine. And I'm just so grateful for the opportunities that we have here, and we'd like to say, it doesn't have to be the big one. Take the next door.
Well, I totally agree with you there, Margaret. You've been a leader in that friendship building kind of environment and connecting folks from our church and others with international guests. I'm deeply appreciative of your work along that line.
All right, any final question here? Back here?
Yeah, concerning how to do reparations. My family came to Central Illinois, bought a farm. And when I wrote the history, our children said, what Indian tribe did we displace? And it turned out to be the Peoria tribe. And they encouraged me, when I sold it, to donate that money back to the Peoria tribe. I did find there were 200 left on a reservation in Oklahoma. And we thought, we will give a scholarship from Lufkin University for this tribe. Then I found out they had a casino and already had made reservations for all of their children to go to university. So that fell through. But a Navajo friend told me it was wrong to say you can have a scholarship at Lufkin University. Give them the money for a scholarship, but don't tell them where they got to go.
Well, I think you're illustrating the complexity that happened. First of all, let me commend you for your action, but you're illustrating the complexity. How does one give? How does one help? We have had toxic charity for many years as a church, and it's difficult to know how to do what is best. Are casinos the best thing for people to get? Actually, some places large amounts of money. That might be toxic income. It's very difficult to know.
All right, back to Cal Redicott.
I'm sorry to repeat another comment. I wonder how many of us here were born on an Indian reservation. Anyone? I was born on the Fort Peck Indian Reservation. It was opened up for settlement in 1912. And all of the Mennonite congregation that settled there in 1912 and 16 tried to convert the natives, and a group of Eastern Mennonite students visited Gloucester, Montana, Wolf Point, Montana, on the Missouri River, interviewed the local pastors, and they said, what have you been doing for the natives around here? They said, well, we've sort of given up because we think that they're demon-possessed.
Let me just take the occasion to promote Cal's book on boyhood memories in that setting. Fascinating stories about his family life as a small boy.
And while we're trading compliments, I want to tell you all that Ervin is also a very meaningful scholar, and his book, From Non-Resistance to Justice, is a classic, and I encourage you to read it because it makes a very important point about rediscovering what non-resistance really means, and it doesn't include justice necessarily.